The borderland lay between two allied packs like a scar that refused to heal, a strip of pine and slate where patrol paths frayed into silence. Old treaty stones still stood, lichen thick and cracked, but no one maintained them, and the wind carried the smell of rain and distant smoke instead of authority. Even the birds seemed cautious, lifting off in short, nervous bursts. Alphas avoided this place because it offered no glory, only ambiguity. Law thinned here, and with it, mercy. Tonight a moon hung low, and the ground glittered with frost, as if the world held its breath. In that hush moved Leora, an Omega by mark and by the way others looked past her. She wore no bright insignia, only a plain cloak and the steady posture of someone trained to occupy little space. Years of being assigned the last shift and the least thanked tasks had taught her timing, listening, and the discipline of quiet. Composure had become her armor, not pride. She remembered every slight, yet she did not flinch at them, she stored them like kindling. Tonight she carried supplies meant for envoys, and she expected to return unseen before the border swallowed dawn. Earlier, the truce had seemed simple. 2 packs would trade medicine for safe passage, then leave the border quiet again. The meeting broke apart when a messenger arrived late, breathless, claiming the route behind them had been shadowed for miles. No proof, only the tremor in his voice and the sudden tightening of the Alpha's jaw. Orders snapped through the group, and the envoys turned back in a rush that felt like shame. Leora was told to follow, then caught in the churn of bodies and wagons until the last torchlight vanished beyond the trees, leaving her alone with echoes. For a moment she stood with the supplies digging into her shoulder and the cold biting through her gloves, trying to decide whether she had been forgotten or deliberately abandoned. Panic rose like an animal in her ribs, urging her to run after the others, to beg for space in their retreat. She forced herself to breathe slowly, counting heartbeats, measuring the darkness by the sounds it did not make. If she chased them, she would arrive frantic, confirming every belief about Omegas being liabilities. If she stayed, she might be punished later, but she would keep her shape intact. The border itself felt awake, as though the ground remembered every broken promise and held them in its stones. Frost veined the fallen branches in patterns like runes, and the air carried a metallic tang that did not belong to winter. Leora had heard elders call this place cursed, not by magic but by choices repeated for generations. Still, standing there, she sensed a pressure that was not only fear. It was the heavy certainty of being seen by something larger than rank. The thought should have comforted her, yet it sharpened her loneliness as if fate had chosen tonight. She adjusted the strap and moved toward a stand of cedars where the terrain narrowed, choosing a route that kept her back from open ground. Every few steps she paused, letting the silence settle, testing whether it shifted around her. Twice she caught the faintest scrape, too soft for footsteps yet too deliberate for wind. She told herself it was a fox, a falling cone, anything ordinary. Her mind, trained to read moods, now read the forest, noticing how the darkness seemed to lean. She resisted the urge to call out. Answers could bring attention she did not want nearby. At the narrow pass she found a strip of cloth snagged on thorns, dyed a color used by no pack she knew. It looked freshly torn, edges damp with melted frost. Nearby, the mud held prints that were careful, as if their owner had tried not to offend the earth. Leora's throat tightened. The worst threats were not loud, they waited, letting imagination sharpen into panic. She weighed retreat, then imagined the pack's suspicion and the punishment of being blamed for chaos. She tucked the cloth away as proof and moved on, letting borrowed courage steady her steps inwardly alone. The trees thinned into a stony clearing where the border markers formed a crooked line. Leora stopped at the nearest stone and brushed away snow, revealing old symbols carved deep enough to outlast politics. She listened again, and this time the silence was different, layered, as though another listener shared it. A faint scent drifted across the clearing, not wolf and not human, but something in between, mixed with smoke and bitter herbs. Her instincts warned her to mask fear and keep her face calm. She set the satchel down slowly, as if unhurried even while her pulse hammered ribs. She could have slipped back into the trees, vanished the way she always did, but something stubborn anchored her to the frozen ground. If danger had come to test the border, she would meet it without offering panic. She straightened and scanned the clearing with deliberate patience. The moonlight looked too clean, exposing every lie people told about strength and worth. Her mind flicked through choices, signal, sprint, bargain, then settled on the only thing she controlled, her refusal to be reduced. She waited, listening, letting the silence lengthen until it felt less like absence and more like judgment just ahead now. A shadow detached from the far edge of the clearing, where rock met bramble, moving like it had waited for her. No howl announced it, no rush, only the quiet certainty of a presence that expected obedience. Leora felt the air tighten, as if the border itself recognized an intruder. She kept her hands visible, palms open, not in surrender but in control. Her pulse begged her to bolt, yet her spine stayed firm. The figure's scent carried smoke and old resentment. When it stepped into the moonlight at last, the rogue was real, and Leora did not run anyway. The rogue did not rush her, and that restraint made him more dangerous than any frantic attacker. He stayed half in moonlight, half in shadow, letting the border stones frame him like a verdict. Scars cut across his cheek and throat in pale, uneven lines, the kind left by claws and winter rather than clean steel. His eyes carried the flat patience of someone who had learned to live without comfort, and his scent held smoke and a bitterness that clung like old grievance. He looked at Leora as if her rank were not a fact but an insult that needed correcting. He circled the clearing with quiet precision, measuring distances the way a hunter measured breath. He did not need to threaten her with strength, he threatened her with certainty. This was a rogue who understood packs well enough to hate them properly, and that hatred gave him focus. He treated the border like a stage meant for humiliation, not slaughter, as if the point was to prove that hierarchy was a lie and omegas were proof of it. His posture suggested exile had not broken him, only sharpened him into something that refused to ask permission anymore. Leora kept her feet planted, but she shifted her weight toward the cedar line, noting which branches were low enough to snag a cloak and which rocks would roll under a hurried step. She did not have an alpha's reach or a fighter's training, but she had learned the one skill no one valued until it mattered, reading intent. The rogue wanted her to panic. He wanted her to confirm every lazy story told about omegas being helpless and grateful for scraps. She forced her breathing slow, letting her gaze drift past him instead of locking into a challenge he could twist against her. When he moved closer, he chose the angle that cut her off from the most obvious retreat. That was his first mistake. Leora had spent her life noticing what others missed, because invisibility made observation a necessity. She had watched Alpha's posture in council halls and seen the blind spots, the moments when pride made him predictable. Now she watched the rogue's shoulders, the slight favoritism in his left side, the fraction of hesitation near the stones. He was confident, but confidence meant he assumed she would move in the direction fear usually chose. A memory rose uninvited, not as comfort but as instruction. She remembered a winter when the stores ran low and the higher ranks ate first, leaving the rest to pretend they were not hungry. She had been sent to gather water at night because omegas were considered replaceable. She learned then to walk without wasting heat, to hide trembling hands inside sleeves, to listen for ice shifting beneath snow. Neglect had taught her economy. Quiet had taught her timing. Endurance was not heroic, it was simply what happened when no one came to save her. The rogue's attention fixed on the satchel at her feet, and she recognized a second intention beneath the first. He wanted the supplies, but more than that, he wanted proof that the packs could not protect what they claimed to own. He began to taunt her insignificance in the tone of someone repeating doctrine, as if he had heard it all his life and now used it like a knife. He implied that omegas survived only because others allowed it, that their value was measured in obedience, not will. He treated her presence here as an invitation to. Leora did not respond with pleading or fury. Instead, she let the insult land and harden inside her, turning fear into something steadier. Dignity, she realized, was not a gift from rank. It was a decision made in private. She had spent years swallowing humiliation to keep peace, but there was a line between peace and surrender, and tonight she stood on the far side of it. If she ran, she would carry his judgment into every future step. If she held, even trembling, she would keep one truth: she did not exist to be convenient. She moved first, not toward him but toward the border marker, stepping onto the slightly raised stone base where frost made the ground slick. It looked like a mistake, and that was the point. The rogue adjusted, expecting her balance to fail, and in that adjustment he exposed the path he wanted to force her into. Leora used the terrain the way she used silence, as misdirection. She slid one foot back, letting gravel scatter with deliberate noise, then shifted sideways into the shallow dip where brush grew thick and uneven. The rogue followed, and the clearing tightened into a corridor of shadowed branches. Here, speed mattered less than control, and Leora took what control she could. She brushed past a cedar trunk and snapped a low dead limb loose as she went, not as a weapon meant to harm, but as a barrier meant to buy seconds. The branch caught on brush between them, slowing him just enough to change the rhythm. She did not look back, because looking back turned fear into a leash. She listened instead, tracking him by breath and footfall. He did not crash through the obstacle, he solved it, and that skill raised the danger again. He was not a wild animal but a strategist, the kind of rogue packs created when they discarded people and called it justice. Leora's thoughts flashed through another set of memories, moments of being ignored in crowded rooms, of learning to exit before anger turned toward her. She remembered how to become uninteresting, how to vanish. But vanishing would not work now. He had chosen her as his proof, and proofs were not allowed to slip away. She angled toward a narrow ravine where the ground broke into uneven stone. The drop was not lethal, but it was steep enough to punish recklessness, and the path along its edge forced careful steps. If he wanted to corner her, he would have to commit to the same risky footing. The rogue's taunts shifted into a colder promise, implying she would end as all Omegas did when no one watched. Leora felt the words try to pull her back into old shame, and she refused. She chose to believe her life was not an argument for anyone else's cruelty. At the ravine's edge, the air changed, carrying a faint scent that did not belong to the rogue or the forest. It was distant, restrained, almost hidden beneath the frost, as if someone powerful had passed through recently and left only a trace. Leora's instincts flickered with confusion, then sharpened. She was being observed. The realization did not soothe her, it made everything more precarious. If someone watched and did nothing, then she truly stood alone. If someone watched and waited, then her choices mattered to more than her survival. The road closed in, patient again, forcing her to the narrowest stretch where stone met thorn. He lifted his arm with a final, decisive motion that promised an ending he believed she could not deny. Leora did not beg. She steadied her feet, braced her shoulders, and fixed her gaze past him toward the dark where that unfamiliar scent lingered, as if daring fate to show its hand. The world narrowed to one breath, one heartbeat, one choice, and time seemed to hold its breath with her. He had been there longer than either of them realized, folded into the dark the way a storm folded into the horizon before anyone noticed the air change. High above the ravine, where the cedars thickened and the ground rose into a rocky shelf, the alphaking watched without moving. His cloak blended with bark and shadow, and even the wind seemed to curve around him, as if instinct itself refused to betray his position. Only the faintest glint of a signet at his wrist marked him as something other than another traveler, and even that was dull beneath leather and restraint. King Alaric had crossed the border alone for a reason that could not be shared with escorts or councils. A ruler who traveled with banners invited ambush and rumor in equal measure, and the borderlands thrived on both. He had left his territory under the cover of routine patrol rotations, claiming inspection of trade routes while carrying a quieter mission beneath the official one. The alliance between packs had begun to fray, not in open rebellion but in subtle failures, missing messengers and delayed shipments, whispers that the old treaties were being tested. A king could not rely on reports filtered through pride. He needed to see the fractures himself, and he needed to remain unseen while he did it. From his vantage, he had already mapped the clearing and the ravine like a chessboard, noting where an enemy would hide, where a hunter would wait, where a frightened traveler would run. He had expected smugglers or scouts. He had not expected an Omega left behind with supplies, standing in a place that did not forgive the weak. At first he had assumed she was bait, a deliberate lure meant to draw out threats. Then he watched the pack's retreating torchlight vanish and realized she truly had been abandoned in the chaos. That discovery did not surprise him, it simply confirmed what he knew about how hierarchies rotted when left unquestioned. He studied her the way he studied contested borders, looking for the point of collapse. The Omega's posture did not fold. Her breathing steadied instead of breaking. She moved with caution, but not with submission. She did not throw herself into panic or plead with the night for mercy. Even when the rogue emerged, she held her hands visible as if she was the one deciding what the moment would become. That kind of composure from a low-ranked dwarf was rare, and in a kingdom built on dominance rituals, rare was always dangerous. Alaric had spent years enforcing order without becoming its slave. Authority could easily turn into arrogance, and arrogance could turn a king into a tyrant. He kept a code that limited interference beyond his borders unless the threat had implications for the realm. The borderlands were complicated. Every intervention created ripples, and ripples became wars when pride joined them. He had learned to watch first, to measure intent before action. A king who reacted too quickly could be manipulated by staged violence or manufactured suffering. Restraint was not hesitation, it was strategy. Yet restraint carried a cost he rarely admitted even to himself. It required him to witness injustice without correcting it, to allow cruelty to play out so he could identify its source. The longer he ruled, the more often he found himself deciding which wrongs were tolerable in the short term to prevent larger collapse. He hated that arithmetic. He hated the way it hardened him, the way it demanded that his heart be quieter than his crown. Tonight, that balance was already strained by the rogue's presence, and it tightened further each time the Omega refused to become the easy victim the world expected. The rogue's movements confirmed what Alaric suspected. This was not random predation. The man moved with purpose, using taunts like tools, steering the Omega toward the ravine with calculated patience. Exile had not turned him feral, it had refined him. Alaric recognized the pattern of a grievance that had matured into ideology. The rogue wanted a symbol, an example he could carry back to other outcasts as proof that pack law was hollow. Supplies mattered, yes, but humiliation mattered more. An Omega abandoned at the border was not merely prey, it was propaganda. Alaric's jaw tightened as he watched the rogue raise his arm for a final strike. The moment sharpened into something intimate despite the distance, because the Omega did not collapse into terror. She braced herself. She chose to meet what was coming without surrendering her gaze or her dignity. That refusal struck Alaric like a sudden gust through a door left ajar, not because it was loud, but because it exposed how rare integrity had become under the weight of rank. If she fell here, the border would swallow her story, and no council would care enough to ask why an Omega died carrying envoys' supplies. The king's code of non-interference had been built to protect stability, not to excuse cowardice. Still, stepping in carried consequences. If he revealed himself, word could travel faster than reason. His enemies would claim he had crossed borders to intimidate allied packs or to enforce dominance beyond treaty lines. His own council would accuse him of recklessness, of prioritizing a stranger's life over political balance. Worse, if the rogue escaped, he could spread the tale of an Alpha King intervening for an Omega, twisting it into weakness or scandal. Alaric had spent years turning perception into a shield for his realm. One misstep could crack it, but the alternative was to let the rogue's logic stand uncontested. If exiles learned they could stage brutality on the border and face no consequence, the unrest he had come to investigate would escalate. If allied packs learned the Alpha King watched suffering and did nothing, alliances would decay into distrust. And if Alaric himself learned he could witness an innocent being used as an object lesson and still remain hidden, then the crown had already hollowed him out more than any enemy ever could. Leadership was not only about guarding borders. It was about guarding what the realm believed it was. A flicker of instinct surged through him, old and undeniable, the part of him that had once fought before he ruled. It was not only rage at the rogue. It was recognition of the Omega's defiance as something that deserved protection, not because she was weak, but because she had chosen strength without permission. Alaric did not romanticize that choice, he understood how it would punish her later. Pax did not forgive Omegas who reminded him of their own failures. The moment she survived, she would become inconvenient. That made her braver than most. He measured the terrain again, calculating the shortest path to intercept without giving the rogue time to retreat. He could close the distance in seconds if he committed fully, but commitment meant exposure. He glanced toward the treaty stones, imagining the rumors that would cling to them by sunrise. His mind ran through the faces of council members who would demand justification. He felt the familiar weight of secrecy, the way it pressed against his ribs, and he realized he was tired of hiding behind it when hiding served only fear dressed as policy. Below, the rogue's arm lifted higher. The Omega held her ground. The air seemed to tighten around the ravine, as if even the forest sensed a threshold being crossed. Alaric's decision arrived not as a dramatic revelation but as a quiet certainty, the kind that settled into the bones when the mind stopped negotiating. He would not allow the borderlands to become a theater for cruelty. He would not allow his restraint to become complicity. If the world wanted to interpret his action as weakness, then it had forgotten what true power looked like. He moved. The descent from the rocky shelf was swift and controlled, a silent drop through branches and shadow. His boots found purchase where others would slip. His cloak shifted once, then fell still again. The scent he carried, tightly leashed until now, spread into the air like a command, deep and unmistakable, the presence of an alpha not merely dominant but absolute. The rogue froze for the briefest fraction, sensing something behind him that did not belong to the border's usual emptiness. Leora felt it before she saw him, that sudden pressure of authority in the air, like a door opening onto a vast room. The rogue's raised arm stalled mid-motion, and the world held its breath again, but this time the pause did not feel like waiting for her to fall. It felt like the ground itself had decided the outcome was no longer the rogue's to choose. A shadow separated from shadow, and a man stepped into the moonlight with the calm of someone who did not need to announce his strength to be obeyed. The rogue's raised arm did not fall. It hovered in the cold air, suddenly uncertain, as if the border itself had shifted its rules without warning. The new presence in the clearing carried no frantic energy, no theatrical threat. It was steadier than that, heavier, the kind of control that made even the wind seem careful. Leora felt it like pressure behind her eyes, like the sensation of standing too close to a cliff and realizing the drop was real. The rogue felt it too, and for the first time his confidence fractured into calculation. The man who stepped forward did not announce himself with a shout. He did not lunge, and he did not bare teeth for intimidation. He simply moved into the moonlight and stopped at a distance that was both respectful and commanding, placing himself between Leora and the rogue with deliberate geometry. His posture made a statement all on its own. The encounter was over because he had decided it was over. The air around him carried a restrained alpha scent, not wild dominance, but disciplined authority, the kind that had been honed into a tool rather than a temper. The rogue's eyes narrowed, scanning for escorts that were not there. His gaze returned to the stranger's face and then to the subtle mark at his wrist, the barely visible signet that should not have been this far beyond any safe territory. Suspicion sharpened the rogue's expression, but it could not fully mask the flicker of recognition. Leora watched the change and realized the rogue knew more than he wanted to admit. The borderland, abandoned by law, suddenly felt occupied by something higher than law. The Alpha King spoke without raising his voice, and the sound carried through the clearing like a verdict read aloud in a room that had been pretending it was empty. He did not threaten the rogue with pain. He threatened him with consequence. His words were calm enough to be mistaken for mercy, but the meaning underneath was iron: leave and live, stay and become an example that outlasted the night. It was not brutality that ended the rogue's momentum. It was the certainty that this Alpha could enforce what he promised without needing to prove it. The rogue tried to turn the moment into a performance, shifting his stance as if he could reclaim control through mockery. He implied that a lone Alpha had no right to interfere here, that packs abandoned borders and called it strategy, that kings hid behind titles while Omegas bled for their politics. His voice carried the bitterness of exile, and in it Leora heard a deeper hunger than revenge. The rogue wanted acknowledgement. He wanted the world to admit what it had done to him, even if the admission came through chaos. The Alpha King did not deny the world's cruelty. That was what made him dangerous. He let the rogue speak until the words ran out of breath, then answered with a restraint that felt sharper than anger. He addressed the rogue's grievance without indulging it, separating suffering from entitlement with a precision that left no room for self-pity to masquerade as justice. He named the pattern Leora had sensed: outcasts gathering, testing borders, trying to turn neglect into a weapon. He did not speak as if guessing. He spoke as if he had been following the trail for some time and had simply chosen when to step into view. The rogue's expression tightened, and Leora saw the truth land. This was not just a random clash in the woods. It was a thread in a larger unraveling. The rogue had believed the border was empty, that no one powerful cared what happened here, and that belief had fed his boldness. Now the border felt watched, and the rogue's ideology, built on being ignored, had nowhere to hide. He shifted again, eyes flicking past the Alpha King as if calculating escape routes, but the Alpha's stillness suggested those routes had already been accounted for. Leora expected the Alpha to move closer, to dominate the space, to crush the rogue's defiance with sheer presence. Instead, he made a different choice. He lifted one hand slightly, palm open, the gesture of a ruler offering a final chance rather than a fighter demanding surrender. It was controlled and quietly humiliating, because it made violence unnecessary. The rogue hesitated, and hesitation was the first real defeat. His arm lowered by inches, then more, until it rested at his side. He was not disarmed by force. He was disarmed by the realization that he no longer controlled the story. A tense silence stretched. The rogue's gaze lingered on Leora as if deciding whether to punish her for surviving long enough to be seen. Leora did not flinch. She kept her stance, refusing to shrink into gratitude. She would not be used as bait again, not by the rogue's hatred and not by pack politics disguised as rescue. The rogue's mouth tightened into something like disgust, but beneath it there was something else, a frustration that the Omega had not played her expected role. Without the spectacle of her fear, he had less to carry back to the other exiles. At last the rogue took a slow step backward. It was not a retreat with dignity, but it was a retreat. He left with a final warning shaped like a promise, hinting that borders were only the beginning and that abandonment created more rogues than any forest ever could. The words hung in the air after he slipped into the trees, not because they were eloquent, but because they sounded plausible. Leora watched the darkness swallow him and felt the aftertaste of it settle into her chest. The threat had not ended. It had only changed direction. When the clearing fell quiet again, the Alpha King did not immediately turn to Leora with reassurance. He studied the edge of the forest where the rogue had vanished, as if listening to footsteps too distant for ordinary hearing. Then he looked at her, and the attention landed with more weight than any praise could have carried. His gaze did not roam over her like property. It assessed her like an unknown variable in a fragile equation. Leora had been looked at her whole life, but never like this. This was not dismissal. This was consideration. She straightened without thinking, lifting her chin just enough to make it clear she would not bow. The impulse surprised her, but she did not take it back. A king could be standing in front of her, and still she would not fold herself into submission just to be permitted to breathe. The Alpha King's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in something more unsettled. He had expected fear, gratitude, relief. He found a quiet defiance that did not ask permission. It shifted the balance between them in a way neither of them named. The space between them tightened with unspoken meaning. Leora could sense his authority like a storm held behind a wall, and she could sense his restraint as an equally powerful choice. He had stepped in, but he had not explained why. He had ended a threat without spectacle, but he had also revealed that he had been watching. That fact pressed against her ribs. If he had been near enough to intervene, he had been near enough to let it happen. The thought stirred a sharp, dangerous question in her mind, and she kept it behind her teeth. The Alpha King spoke again, still calm, still measured. He told her the border was no longer safe, that exiles were moving in ways most packs were too proud to admit. He offered protection in the same tone a ruler offered law, not sentimental, not intimate, but absolute in its intent. Yet he did not offer explanations, and he did not soften the truth with comfort. His hand did not reach for her. His words did not ask what she wanted. He simply placed a path in front of her and made it clear the night would not forgive hesitation. Leora stared at him, feeling the weight of the offer and the sharp absence of answers. Protection from a king could be a shelter or a cage, depending on what he intended to do with the truth he had just witnessed in her. The border wind lifted her cloak, and for a moment the clearing felt like the center of a larger game she had never agreed to play. She forced herself to breathe and held his gaze as if it were another terrain to navigate, because something told her the next step would decide more than where she slept. The Alpha King waited, offering protection, but not answers. They did not leave the borderland with ceremony. The Alpha King moved first, not because he expected obedience, but because he understood terrain the way he understood politics, as something that punished hesitation. He indicated a route along the ravine that avoided the open clearing and the treaty stones, and Leora followed at a measured distance that made her own terms clear. She kept the satchel strapped across her shoulder, refusing to let him take it as though she could be relieved of responsibility along with danger. The night was still bitter, but now it carried a different tension, the uneasy awareness that two lives had become entangled without agreement. Alaric did not glance back often, yet Leora could feel his attention in the pauses between his steps. He walked like someone trained to move quietly without appearing to try, and when he stopped to listen, he became as still as a carved figure. He did not speak in the soft, coaxing tone higher ranks sometimes used on Omegas to disguise control as kindness. His silence was not dismissive, it was restrained, as if he was choosing words that would not become promises he might regret. That choice unsettled her more than arrogance would have. Arrogance was predictable, restraint could be a trap. Leora kept her eyes on the path, but her mind spun around the offer he had made. Protection from a king sounded like safety, yet she had learned that safety often demanded payment in pieces of self. She had seen Omegas taken into households as symbols, quiet ornaments used to soften reputations, then discarded the moment they became inconvenient. She had watched leaders excuse cruelty by calling it order. The idea of being claimed, by a territory, by a crown, by an alpha's instinct, turned her stomach with a fear deeper than the rogue's threat. A rogue could be outrun. A king could not. As they moved through a stand of cedars, the air seemed to tighten again, not with danger, but with an unfamiliar pull that brushed against Leora's senses. It was faint, like the first pressure change before a storm, subtle enough to doubt. She had felt bonds in stories, spoken of in warnings and whispered hopes, but she had never believed such things were meant for her. Omegas were often told they were lucky to be tolerated, not chosen. Yet something about the Alpha King's presence sat too close to her breath, as if her body recognized him before her mind allowed it. Alaric felt it as well, and his steps shortened almost imperceptibly. The scent he kept leash tightened, then steadied, as if he were forcing it back behind discipline. Leora caught the shift and recognized it as a decision, not a reflex. He was fighting something inside himself, and that meant the tension between them was not one-sided. It made her wary, because an alpha fighting instinct was still an alpha with instinct, and instinct could become possession if it won. She found herself measuring him the way she had measured the rogue, not for violence, but for intent. They reached a narrow ridge where the trees thinned and the sky opened above them in a pale slice of moon. From there, distant torchlights marked a patrol line from one of the allied packs, moving like slow fireflies along the far slope. Alaric stopped, watching them with the unreadable focus of a ruler reading a map. Leora expected him to signal, to call him over and hand her off like a problem resolved. Instead, he waited until the patrol passed out of sight, then guided her down a steeper path that kept them hidden. He was avoiding being seen. The realization sharpened Leora's suspicion. If he was truly the Alpha King, why move like a fugitive? Why protect her in secret rather than in law? She wanted to demand answers, but she knew how questions sounded coming from an Omega. Questions could be framed as insolence. She kept hers behind her teeth and watched him more closely. The calm control he carried seemed genuine, yet she sensed something burdened beneath it, an exhaustion that did not come from travel. His restraint felt practiced, as if it had been demanded of him so long it had become habit. When they paused near a shallow creek, Leora crouched to wet her hands, letting the cold water sting her skin into clarity. Alaric remained standing, scanning the trees, but his attention flicked toward her when she did not ask permission to stop. Most Omegas would have waited for instruction. She did not. She drank, then stood, and the space between them filled with a quiet challenge. Neither spoke aloud. Alaric's gaze held hers for a beat longer than necessary, not in threat, but in recognition. He seemed to register that her independence was not performance. It was survival turned into identity. The bond's faint pull flared again when she stepped close to pass him, and Leora's breath caught despite herself. It was not romantic warmth. It was a dangerous awareness, like standing near a powerful current. She felt an unwanted clarity about him, his steadiness, his restraint, the loneliness threaded through his control. It unsettled her because it made him less distant, less myth, more real. She had survived by keeping her heart small. This pull threatened to make it expand. Alaric's jaw tightened, and his eyes shifted away as if refusing to acknowledge what his senses insisted on. He did not assert dominance to test her. He did not demand that she follow closer. He simply resumed walking, and the silence between them became charged with everything he refused to say. Leora sensed the effort in that silence. It cost him something. That cost suggested he understood the stakes. A king bound to an Omega would become a story that enemies could weaponize, and stories, in a kingdom like his, could kill reputations faster than any blade. They skirted the edge of a small outpost at dawn, a rough collection of cabins used by traders and scouts. Smoke rose from one chimney, and two wolves stood outside, talking in low tones. When they saw Alaric, their bodies stiffened with instinctive respect before their minds fully processed why. The gaze then snapped to Leora, and something changed. The look was not simple curiosity. It was a quick assessment, a silent calculation of why an Omega walked near a man who carried authority like an inheritance. Suspicion tightened their faces. Resentment flickered in their eyes. Leora felt her skin prickle. She understood then that being near him altered her value in the eyes of others, not upward in dignity, but upward in threat. An Omega alone was invisible. An Omega beside a king became a question people wanted answered, and questions made people dangerous. The outpost wolves did not step closer, but their attention followed them too long, and Leora could almost hear the rumor forming. Alaric said nothing, yet his pace quickened as if he had anticipated this reaction. His silence was not ignorance. It was strategy. As the sun climbed, they moved into denser forest again, leaving the outpost behind. Leora's thoughts swirled with fear, not of the rogue now, but of the social consequences unfolding like a trap tightening. She could already imagine how her pack would interpret her return in the company of a king. They would not celebrate her survival. They would question how she earned it. They would look for ways to blame or exploit her. The bond's faint pull stirred again, stronger this time, and she had to clench her hands to keep them from shaking. Alaric slowed near a fallen tree and finally looked at her as if weighing whether honesty would help or harm. His expression held restraint, but also a flicker of something that could have been regret. He did not apologize for intervening. He did not promise safety. He simply held her gaze with the gravity of someone who understood that proximity itself was becoming a threat. Leora felt the bond pulse between them like a hidden heartbeat, unwanted and undeniable, and she realized with sudden clarity that it was not fading with distance. It was growing, tightening, stirring stronger with every step, threatening to expose them both. By midday the forest thinned into a rough stretch of rock and scrub where the wind cut cleanly through the trees, stripping away the illusion of privacy. Alaric chose a hollow between two boulders to rest, a place that hid them from the open slope but left a clear line of sight in every direction. It was the kind of pause that felt calculated rather than tired, and Leora understood he was buying them minutes to think, not comfort. She set the satchel down and remained standing, letting distance speak for her in a way words might not survive. He studied her as if deciding whether truth was protection or a weapon. The quiet between them had grown heavy since the outpost, weighted by the looks they had drawn and the rumors that would now move faster than any footpath. Leora could feel those rumors forming like smoke. An Omega traveling near a powerful Alpha, an Alpha traveling alone beyond his borders, a rogue retreating rather than finishing what he started. None of it fit the stories Pax preferred, and Pax punished what did not fit. She waited, refusing to ask first, because questions from an Omega were too easily turned into confession. Alaric reached beneath his cloak and drew out the signet she had glimpsed only briefly before, holding it in the light so the etched crest could not be mistaken. Even if Leora had never stood in a council hall, she had seen that symbol stamped into treaty parchment, carved into border stones, stitched into banners carried on holy days. The crown did not sit on his head, but it sat in that mark, in the way the air seemed to recognize him. Her stomach tightened as understanding moved from suspicion into certainty. This was not merely a high-ranking alpha with influence. This was the Alpha King. The knowledge hit with an almost physical force. It explained the instinctive deference she had seen at the outpost, the way the men had stiffened before they even understood why. It explained the disciplined restraint, the measured silence, the way he moved like someone who could not afford to be careless because carelessness in a ruler became catastrophe for everyone else. It also made everything more dangerous. If she had been abandoned as an Omega, she had been saved as something else entirely, and that shift in meaning was a trap that could close on her throat. Leora kept her expression composed, but inside her thoughts scattered, then reformed with sharp edges. If the Alpha King had intervened for her, then her survival was no longer private. It was political. An Omega protected by a king would be seen as a provocation by some, a scandal by others, a weakness by enemies hungry for leverage. She pictured councils leaning over maps, not of territory, but of reputations. She pictured her own Pax leaders calculating what to do with her now that she had become visible. The cost of being seen was that people began to decide what you were worth to them. Alaric watched her face closely, as if expecting her to fold under the weight of his identity. When she did not, something eased in his posture, barely. He spoke in a low, controlled tone, explaining what the crest truly meant. A crown, he implied, was not only power. It was surveillance, obligation, and the constant threat of being misunderstood on purpose. He said he'd traveled alone because his court had become too loud with competing agendas. Every report arrived shaped by someone's ambition. Every gesture of protection could be twisted into a narrative of favoritism or weakness. He trusted his own eyes more than he trusted polished counsel. Leora listened without interrupting, because she understood the anatomy of being unheard. Still, she did not let his confession turn him into a victim. A king carried burdens, yes, but he also carried choices. She needed to know why his choice had involved her. Alaric admitted the truth without dressing it as heroism. He rarely interfered beyond his borders because each intervention created expectations, and expectations could be exploited. Enemies staged crises to draw him out. Allies resented his presence when it made them look small. The realm required stability more than spectacle, and he had learned to keep his hands clean to keep the peace. Then he admitted what had broken that rule. He said the rogue was not simply a lone threat but part of a pattern of unrest. Exiles and outcasts were moving with intention, probing where alliances were weak, spreading distrust through calculated acts meant to spark retaliation. He had come to confirm those suspicions. Yet it was not strategy alone that pushed him into the clearing. He had watched Leora refuse to submit, watched her stand in a place abandoned by law and still choose dignity over panic. That refusal mattered because it revealed how brittle the hierarchy had become. It revealed how easily a kingdom could lose its soul while insisting it had order. Leora felt the bonds pull again, subtle but persistent, as if the truth between them had given it room to breathe. It frightened her more than his confession. A bond was not merely a private connection, it was a claim the world recognized whether she wanted it or not. She had spent her life avoiding claims. Yet Alaric's honesty, plain, unsentimental, and dangerous, made her wary trust form in spite of herself. He had not flattered her. He had not promised comfort. He had told her what the situation was and what it could become, and that was a kind of respect she had rarely been given. Trust did not arrive as warmth. It arrived as a cautious alignment of interests and a shared refusal to lie about the stakes. Leora told him, in her own measured way, that she would not be used as proof of anything. Not of his mercy, not of his weakness, not of his strength. She had fought to keep her dignity intact, and she would not trade it for protection. Alaric accepted her stance without argument, and the acceptance felt like a crack in the world's usual script. He did not demand gratitude. He treated her resistance as information, not insubordination. Even as that fragile trust formed, the world beyond their hollow was already shifting. At the outpost, the wolves who had seen them would speak. A trader would mention a lone alpha with a king's scent moving through the border woods. A scout would report a rogue retreating rather than attacking, and someone would ask why. Rumors would travel to councils, then to enemies, then to those who lived off chaos. Leora could almost feel eyes turning toward her from far away, not because they cared who she was, but because her existence now intersected with a crown. By late afternoon, a messenger found them, not by accident but by skill. He emerged from the trees with the cautious posture of someone approaching a storm, his gaze dipping toward Alaric's wrist before he forced it back up. He did not kneel, but his respect was unmistakable. The message he carried was brief and sharp, delivered with the urgency of someone who knew he might not get a second chance to deliver it. The words were not shouted. They did not need to be. They cut cleanly through the air. An allied council had received reports of the king's presence beyond the border, and they had already decided what it meant. They feared the appearance of interference and the chaos it could ignite. They also feared the rumors spreading about an Omega traveling with him, rumors that suggested a bond forming in the shadows. To contain the story, they demanded a solution that would look like order. The ultimatum was simple, ruthless, and dressed as necessity. The Omega must be surrendered to council custody immediately, or the alliance would be declared compromised. Leora felt the demand land like ice in her veins. Custody would not be protection. It would be control. It would be a polite cage built from tradition and fear. She looked at Alaric and saw the moment tighten around him, forcing him into a choice between stability and defiance. He did not speak right away. His expression was calm, but the stillness in him sharpened into something colder, as if he were already calculating the cost of refusing. Leora understood then that being seen had placed her at the center of consequences she never asked for, and the world had decided her life was negotiable. The ultimatum did not end with the messenger's last word. It lingered in the cold air between the boulders like a stain that would not lift, turning the hollow into a chamber of judgment. Alaric took the sealed strip of parchment, read it once, and then held it a moment longer as if staring at ink could change its meaning. His face did not tighten with anger, it settled into a quieter, more dangerous stillness. Leora recognized it as the same restraint he had shown on the border, the kind that came when a powerful person chose control over reaction. That control made her fear for him more than a shout would have. He dismissed the messenger with a nod that carried finality, and the man vanished into the trees with visible relief. When they were alone again, Alaric did not immediately speak. He looked outward, toward the unseen roads where councils gathered and rumors multiplied, and Leora realized he was listening beyond the forest, hearing the realm in the way a king had to hear it. The demand was not truly from one allied council. It was from the instinct of every leader who feared instability and feared being mocked for it. Surrendering an Omega was easy. It looked like order. It looked like tradition winning. It looked like a problem erased without anyone having to admit the problem existed. Leora's mind moved ahead of his words, because she had lived her life anticipating what higher ranks would do. The moment an Omega became inconvenient, people called it necessity. The moment an Omega became visible, people called it threat. She had seen those patterns enough to know that custody meant isolation, interrogation, and eventually some quiet arrangement that returned the story to the shape leaders preferred. Her survival had already cost her peace. If she stayed with Alaric, it would cost him more than peace. It could cost him alliance, credibility, maybe even his crown if enemies seized the narrative fast enough. Alaric finally spoke, his tone measured, not because he was indifferent but because he refused to let the council's fear dictate his voice. He said his own court would be no kinder than the allied council, only more sophisticated in how it concealed brutality behind law. The realm was balanced on fragile trust, and trust depended on belief that the alphaking remained above personal entanglement. The mere rumor of a bond forming with an Omega would be treated as scandal by some, weakness by others, and opportunity by the worst. He did not say this to frighten her. He said it because the truth was the only thing he could offer that was not an empty promise. Leora listened, and something inside her hardened into a decision before he even finished. She had survived by making herself smaller, by letting others step around her without stumbling. Now, in a cruel twist, her presence threatened to make a king stumble. She could not allow that. Not because she felt indebted to him, but because she refused to be the instrument of someone else's collapse. If she left, the alliance might stabilize. The councils would have their clean ending. They would congratulate themselves for solving a problem, and Alaric could return to his throne with fewer fractures. Her absence would restore the balance the realm insisted on, even if that balance was built on sacrifice offered by the expendable. She told him she would go. The words fell into the hollow with a simple finality that made the air feel thinner. Leora expected him to reject the idea out of pride or possessiveness. Instead, his gaze sharpened, and she saw the conflict flicker behind his control. He did not argue immediately. That restraint was its own admission. A king did not hesitate unless the choice cut deep. Leora forced herself to hold steady, pushing down the instinctive hope that he would say she mattered. Hope was dangerous. It made people wait for mercy that never came. She explained her reasoning without pleading. The councils wanted a symbol to contain the rumor. If she disappeared quietly, the story could be shaped into something harmless, a lone Omega lost in border unrest, a tragedy that demanded no reform. If she surrendered herself directly, she could at least control the manner of it, choose words that might keep others from being punished. She spoke as if discussing logistics, because emotion would make her decisions seem like weakness. Yet inside, she felt something tear at the edges of her composure, the bond's pull tightening as if it recognized separation as threat. Alaric listened with a stillness that suggested he was restraining more than instinct. Leora could sense it in the way his shoulders held tension, in the way his breath came slower than it should. He was fighting the alpha impulse to claim, to protect by force, to end the problem through dominance. That battle played across his face in small shifts he likely did not realize he revealed. Leadership had taught him to master himself, but mastery did not erase desire. It only forced desire to negotiate with duty, and the negotiation looked like pain. The separation became almost real when Leora lifted the satchel again and tightened the strap, preparing to move toward the nearest council outpost. She chose a route in her mind, imagining the steps, the gates, the cold eyes. The more practical she became, the more her chest tightened, as if her body resisted what her mind had decided. She did not turn away from Alaric, because turning away felt too much like surrender. She wanted to lead as herself, not as someone pushed. She wanted him to remember that she had chosen this, even if choosing hurt. Alaric stepped closer, stopping just short of the space that would have made it intimate. The bond's tension flared between them, a silent pressure that made Leora's skin prickle. He did not touch her. He did not offer comfort. Instead, he spoke with a quiet honesty that cut deeper than reassurance. He told her that disappearing would not end the unrest. It would only feed it, because the rogue's warning had been accurate in one way: abandonment created enemies. If he allowed the councils to erase her, he would be validating the very cruelty that birthed rogues and rebellion. Stability bought with injustice was not stability. It was delayed collapse. Leora felt the trap in his words. If he refused the councils, the alliance could fracture. If he complied, he would lose something inside himself that a crown could not replace. She realized then that this was not only about her safety. It was about what kind of king he would become if he let fear dictate who was sacrificed for peace. The crown was not simply an object. It was a promise to protect the realm's order. But what did order mean if it required offering up the lowest-ranked person to satisfy leaders who refused to confront their own failures? Alaric's gaze held hers, and for the first time she saw exhaustion crack through his restraint, not weakness, but the weight of years spent choosing the lesser harm and calling it governance. He admitted, in a low voice, that he could comply and keep the alliance intact. He could hand her over and watch the council bury the story. He could return to his throne with the appearance of stability restored. But he would know what he had done. He would feel that knowledge every time he asked others to obey law. He would become the kind of ruler who protected systems more than people, and he had already seen where that path led. The moment stretched until Leora could hear her own heartbeat again. She realized that she had offered to leave to protect him, yet her leaving would not protect what mattered most to him. It would protect only the illusion. The bond's pull tightened into a sharp, almost painful clarity, as if it demanded a choice from them both. Alaric turned his head slightly, as though listening to voices only he could hear, council members, allies, enemies, the long memory of the realm, and then he made a decision that landed in the hollow like thunder contained in stone. He said he would not surrender her. The words were not dramatic. They were simply final, spoken with the calm certainty of a king who had found the line he would not cross. Leora felt a rush of conflicting emotion, relief, fear, and a fierce refusal to be grateful in a way that made her smaller. She understood immediately what his decision would cost. Councils would accuse him of favoritism. Enemies would call him compromised. His own court would demand he erase the complications she represented, and those demands would not remain private. They would force a public response, and public responses reshaped kingdoms. Alaric stepped back, already shifting from man to ruler, his mind moving toward the stage the council wanted to force him onto. He told Leora they would return to his territory, not in hiding, but in full view, because secrecy would only feed rumor. Leora's breath caught. Returning in full view meant confrontation. It meant letting the world see what it wanted to pretend did not happen. An Omega had stood, a king had intervened, and now the council would have to choose whether it ruled through fear or through justice. As they left the hollow, the forest seemed less like shelter and more like a corridor leading toward a throne room built from scrutiny. Leora walked beside him, not behind, because he did not order her to fall back. The bond's pull steadied into something heavier, as if it recognized that avoidance was no longer possible. Ahead, beyond the trees, the realm waited with sharpened opinions and ready knives made of rumor. And in the distance, the councils gathered, certain their ultimatum would be obeyed, unaware that the Alpha King was about to defy them publicly. They entered the capital at mid-morning, when the gates stood open and the city breathed with trade and routine. Alaric chose the main road instead of the side paths reserved for quiet arrivals, and that choice alone set the tone. Word moved faster than their steps. By the time they crossed the outer ring, heads had turned, whispers had risen, and eyes had fixed on the Omega walking beside the Alpha King without chains, escort, or bowed posture. Leora felt the weight of that attention press against her skin, not as admiration, but as assessment. Visibility was no longer optional. It was the ground beneath her feet. The council convened within the hour. Alaric did not allow time for private maneuvering or softened explanations. He stood before them as he had always stood, calm, precise, and unyielding, and he spoke without ceremony. He declared his protection over Leora in clear terms that left no room for reinterpretation. She was under the crown's authority, not as property, not as leverage, but as a citizen whose life would not be bargained away to preserve appearances. The word struck the chamber like a fault line cracking open beneath old stone. The reaction was immediate and volatile. Elders invoked tradition, citing centuries of hierarchy that placed Omegas beneath notice, let alone protection from a king. Strategists warned of alliances fraying, of rival packs testing borders the moment weakness was perceived. Others spoke with softer voices but sharper intent, suggesting compromise dressed as mercy, protection that looked like confinement, care that erased agency. Alaric listened without interruption, and when the arguments circled back on themselves, he answered with the quiet authority that had carried his reign. Tradition, he said, was meant to protect the realm, not excuse harm. If tradition demanded sacrifice from the most vulnerable, then tradition had failed its purpose. The backlash did not stay within the council walls. It spilled into the city, into the outlying packs, into places where resentment had already been fermenting. Leaders who had built the power on strict hierarchy felt exposed, as if a light had been turned on in rooms they preferred kept dim. They framed the declaration as favoritism, as emotional compromise, as proof that the Alpha King's judgment had been clouded. Rumors sharpened into accusations. Some claimed the Omega had manipulated him. Others claimed she was a symbol of decay, proof that order was slipping. Unrest flared not because the declaration was radical, but because it threatened the comfort of those who benefited from silence. Leora stood through it all without shrinking. When advisors suggested she remain hidden for her own safety, she refused. She would not become a secret that made the declaration easier to digest. She moved through the capital openly, attending hearings when permitted, walking the streets under watchful eyes, speaking when spoken to and sometimes when not. Her presence unsettled people more than her absence ever could have. An Omega who did not avert her gaze forced others to confront their assumptions, and many responded with anger because anger was easier than self-examination. She asserted her agency not through grand speeches, but through consistency. She corrected misstatements about her actions at the border. She named the neglect that had left her isolated without accusing individuals who would hide behind defensiveness. She refused to perform gratitude in ways that diminished her. When asked why she did not kneel, she answered simply that standing had kept her alive. The simplicity of it infuriated some and steadied others. For the first time, discussions about Omegas included an Omega who would not allow herself to be spoken over. Alaric supported her without overshadowing her. He did not speak for her when she could speak for herself. He intervened only when councils attempted to redirect the narrative back into abstraction, away from lived consequence. Together, they confronted systems that devalued the vulnerable by naming how those systems benefited from invisibility. They spoke of border neglect, of resource hoarding justified as efficiency, of how fear of appearing weak had allowed cruelty to masquerade as order. It was not rhetoric meant to inspire applause. It was an inventory of damage long ignored. The reforms proposed were modest in language and profound in implication. Oversight of border patrol assignments, clear accountability for abandoning envoys, recognition of Omegas as citizens with standing rather than liabilities to be managed. Each proposal triggered fresh resistance. Those who had lost nothing under the old system feared losing influence under the new one. They whispered of rebellion not because the reforms harmed them, but because the reforms exposed them. Power resented being named. Enemies beyond the capital watched closely. Rival leaders saw opportunity in the unrest, sensing a kingdom in transition as a kingdom vulnerable. They framed the Alpha King's declaration as evidence of internal fracture and began to test boundaries with provocations disguised as accidents. Trade routes faltered, messengers were delayed, small conflicts flared where order had once been assumed. Each incident was reported back to the council as proof that reform invited chaos. Each incident was also proof that chaos had been waiting for permission. The bond between Alaric and Leora remained unspoken but undeniable, a quiet alignment that neither denied nor exploited. They were careful with proximity in public, aware that perception could be weaponized. Yet those who watched closely could sense the steadiness between them, the way decisions accounted for one another without becoming indulgent. That steadiness angered opponents more than any display of affection would have. It suggested permanence. It suggested that this was not a momentary lapse, but a shift in how power might be exercised. As unrest spread, clandestine meetings multiplied. Discontented leaders found common cause in fear, uniting across old rivalries with the shared belief that reform threatened their control. They spoke of restoring order, of protecting tradition, of removing the complication at the center of the storm. Leora's name circulated as a shorthand for everything they refused to confront. Plans formed not in the open chambers of law, but in the margins where accountability dissolved. The language of necessity returned, sharpened into resolve. Alaric sensed it before reports confirmed it. Patterns emerged that echoed the rogue's earlier warning: coordination where there should have been coincidence, restraint where there should have been chaos. This was not spontaneous unrest. It was organized resistance testing how far reform could be pushed before it snapped. He convened his closest advisors and spoke plainly. The kingdom was at a crossroads. Retreat would buy temporary calm at the cost of moral collapse. Advance would provoke confrontation that could fracture alliances permanently. Leora understood the risk with a clarity born of survival. She had never mistaken visibility for safety. As threats multiplied, she did not ask to be removed from the equation. She insisted on remaining present, arguing that rebellion fed on symbols left undefended. Hiding her would confirm the narrative that she was the problem. Standing with her would force enemies to show their hands. It was a dangerous logic, but danger had already claimed the field. Pretending otherwise was no longer an option. The first coordinated move came at dusk, when 3 allied packs simultaneously withdrew patrol support from border routes, citing internal emergencies. The message was clear and calculated. Order would be withheld until reform was abandoned. Reports followed of gatherings in contested regions, banners raised not in open revolt yet, but in preparation. The capital's air tightened with anticipation, and the council chamber filled again, this time with fear no one bothered to disguise. Alaric stood before them once more, crown heavy with consequence, and felt the kingdom lean toward a breaking point it had avoided for generations. Leora stood at his side, visible and unyielding, knowing that the storm had arrived not because she existed, but because the system could no longer pretend she did not. Beyond the walls, forces aligned, messages crossed, and the language of rebellion sharpened into action. The kingdom had been forced to change, and now it would be forced to endure the cost, as a coordinated rebellion began. The capital did not erupt in flames or screaming riots. It tightened into watchful quiet, the kind that made every footstep sound like a decision. In the great hall, banners hung as they always had, but the air felt altered, as if tradition itself had been asked to prove it deserved space. Leora stood near the dais without armor, without guards arranged to look reassuring, and without the lowered gaze expected of her rank. She understood that fear fed on performance. If she flinched, the kingdom would call it proof. So she stayed still. Rumors tried to turn her into a story that could be controlled. In taverns and council corridors, she became either a seductress or a captive, either a symbol of compassion or a disease in the bloodline of rule. None of it matched her reality, but reality rarely mattered when power felt threatened. Leora answered with presence instead of argument. She attended hearings. She walked the public corridors. She accepted the looks and refused to offer the comfort of submission. The more she stayed visible, the more the lies had to compete with what people saw, an omega unbroken. The threats arrived dressed as protocol. A clerk misplaced her petition for a safe escort to return supplies. A steward forgot to assign her quarters, expecting her to retreat into shame. A delegate suggested she be relocated to a protected estate outside the city, a polite exile sold as care. Leora refused each attempt to shrink her world. She kept records. She asked for witnesses. She repeated requests calmly until someone had to either comply or openly admit obstruction. Those watching learned a new lesson. Power could be challenged without clause, simply by refusing to disappear. Others began to notice, especially those who had learned silence the same way she had. An Omega who cleaned council chambers started lingering near the door, listening as if her ears mattered. A lower-ranked courier stopped apologizing for taking up space. Even some beaters, long accustomed to being useful but not influential, started asking sharper questions about the border withdrawals. Leora did not gather followers with speeches. She inspired them by existing without permission. Her resilience became contagious, not dramatic, but steady, like a fire that did not flare high yet refused to go out. Alaric watched these shifts with a complicated stillness. He had ruled through discipline for years, measuring every act against potential fallout. Now he saw his people responding to something he had rarely offered publicly, a refusal to bargain away the vulnerable for convenience. Leora's endurance gave him leverage he had not expected. Every time opponents tried to paint his decision as weakness, her composure contradicted them. She did not cling to him as a shield. She stood beside the throne as if she belonged in the realm's story, and her certainty strengthened his own. The conflict spread through politics first, then through systems that made politics real. Several allied pacts stalled trade, claiming temporary disruptions, while quietly testing whether the capital would retreat. Border patrol schedules were altered to leave gaps that looked accidental until patterns emerged. Messengers arrived late with apologies too polished to be sincere. Alaric responded without spectacle. He called councils into open session. He demanded written explanations and made those explanations public. He offered incentives for cooperation and consequences for sabotage, not as punishment, but as clarity. The realm learned that leadership could be firm without being cruel. Yet danger moved through quieter channels, where law could not easily reach. One evening, Leora found her path through the palace gardens subtly redirected by newly closed gates, funneling her toward an isolated colonnade. She recognized the trap not because it was obvious, but because it was familiar. It resembled every moment she had been steered into vulnerability by those who wanted her frightened and compliant. She turned back before reaching the shadows, choosing a crowded corridor instead. The next day, she reported the change in routes with exact details, forcing an investigation that made hidden hands withdraw for the moment. The bond between her and Alaric shifted under this pressure, becoming less like an accident and more like a decision made repeatedly. They did not announce it with ceremony, but they stopped pretending it was nothing. Alaric no longer positioned advisors between them as if distance could erase what people sensed. Leora no longer acted as though closeness meant surrender. Their alignment remained disciplined, built on mutual restraint rather than possessive instinct. Those who wanted to weaponize the bond found it harder to do so when it was neither secret nor scandal, but a choice grounded in purpose. As alliances wavered, Alaric held a summit in the open amphitheater outside the council hall, forcing leaders to speak where citizens could hear. The move angered traditionalists who preferred decisions made in rooms that protected them from accountability. But the crowd changed the calculus. Delegates who would have demanded Leora's surrender behind closed doors hesitated when faced with watchers who had begun to question old hierarchies. Leora stood on the edge of the platform, not as a mascot, but as a witness. When accusations were made about her influence, she corrected them calmly, stating only what had happened at the border and what had been demanded afterward. That restraint did not end conflict, it clarified it. Some pacts recommitted to cooperation, unwilling to be seen as bullies who preyed on the lowest rank to preserve pride. Others withdrew further, exposing themselves as willing to fracture the realm rather than accept reform. The coordinated rebellion did not charge the gates, it tightened its grip through disruption, hoping discomfort would turn the city against the throne. Supplies arrived slower, patrol reports became inconsistent, anxiety climbed. Alaric's council urged compromise. Leora understood compromise often meant sacrifice offered by the powerless. She answered the rising anxiety by refusing to become its outlet. When citizens questioned why a king risked chaos for an Omega, she did not beg for sympathy. She spoke of abandonment without dramatizing it, of survival without boasting, of how cruelty at the edges always returned to the center eventually. Her words were simple enough to be repeated accurately, which made them dangerous to those who relied on distortion. The crowd began to see the rebellion's strategy as coercion rather than righteous protest. That shift did not end the threat, but it weakened its camouflage. The decisive moment came when a coalition of allied pacts delivered a formal pledge of renewed support, publicly condemning the sabotage and reaffirming shared patrol duty. The declaration did not happen because everyone had become virtuous, it happened because the rebellion's pressure had become visible as selfishness. Alaric accepted the pledge and announced oversight measures that made further disruption harder to hide. For the first time in days, the capital exhaled. Leora felt relief and something like grief intertwined, because she knew relief in politics was always temporary, and every victory demanded payment. The payment arrived in a quieter form than anyone expected. One of the first officials who had helped Leora document obstruction, a minor registrar whose careful honesty had emboldened others, was removed from his post overnight under the pretense of administrative restructuring. No blood was spilled, but the message was sharp: cooperation with reform would be punished through erasure. Leora realized then that winning the public moment did not protect the individuals who had dared to shift with it. She stood beside the throne, victorious in the open, while someone who had helped her was quietly destroyed, and the cost hit her like ice. The kingdom did not change all at once. It shifted the way landscapes did after a long winter, not through spectacle, but through small, irreversible movements. Border patrols were restored with oversight that no longer treated abandonment as acceptable loss. Councils rewrote procedures that had once relied on silence to function. The hierarchy still existed, but it bent where it had once snapped, forced to account for lives it had trained itself not to see. Some resisted quietly, others loudly, yet the change held because too many people had witnessed what refusal to kneel looked like. Leora felt the transformation most sharply in the way people addressed her. Not with reverence, not with fear, but with caution edged by recognition. She was no longer invisible, and she was no longer a convenient symbol others could fully control. The city learned her presence did not signal chaos, but accountability. Omegas began to be consulted rather than assigned. Betas questioned decisions that had once passed without challenge. Even alphas adjusted their posture, subtle but real, as if the ground beneath authority had shifted just enough to demand balance. When the council formally acknowledged her status, they did so carefully, framing it as an extension of civic recognition rather than elevation. Leora accepted the declaration without ceremony, because ceremony would have distorted the truth. She did not rise through favor. She rose because the kingdom had been forced to confront what it lost when it erased people like her. Her role was defined not by obedience, but by responsibility, and she made it clear she would not serve as a decorative bridge between power and conscience. Partnership was the only position she would occupy. Alaric's relinquishing of absolute control did not come as abdication, but as recalibration. He amended the crown's authority to require counsel that included those previously excluded, binding his power to shared scrutiny. Some called it risky, others called it overdue. Alaric understood it as necessary. A ruler who could not be questioned eventually mistook fear for loyalty. He had ruled long enough to know the difference now. Sharing strength did not diminish him. It clarified him, turning command into coordination rather than decree. Their bond settled into something steady once it was no longer denied. It did not demand constant closeness or public display. It thrived on trust built through decisions tested under pressure. Alaric did not assert dominance to reassure himself of his place. Leora did not soften herself to make his authority palatable. They chose one another daily in small, disciplined ways, in disagreements handled without humiliation, in boundaries respected rather than exploited. The bond was sealed not through instinct overruling will, but through will guiding instinct into something durable. The court struggled at first with the idea of a queen who did not kneel. They searched for rituals that would place her comfortably within tradition. Leora declined those that required symbolic submission. She accepted those that affirmed duty without erasure. Over time, resistance thinned, not because everyone agreed, but because the kingdom functioned better with her present than without her. Efficiency replaced fear. Accountability replaced rumor. Stability grew not from suppression, but from inclusion carefully enforced. The registrar who had been quietly removed was restored months later, not through apology, but through policy that made quiet erasure more difficult. It was not justice in its purest form, but it was repair. Leora learned to measure victory not by perfection, but by the narrowing of harm. She carried the knowledge of cost with her, refusing to let triumph numb her awareness. Love, she discovered, was not blind devotion. It was vigilance on behalf of one another and the people affected by their choices. As the seasons turned, foreign envoys arrived with interest sharpened by uncertainty. They praised reform while testing boundaries, offering alliances laced with conditions meant to reclaim leverage. Alaric and Leora received them together, presenting a united front that did not rely on intimidation. They listened, responded, and declined when offers required the sacrifice of principles already paid for in bloodless but painful ways. The kingdom's reputation shifted from predictable to principled, and unpredictability unsettled those who preferred control without scrutiny. Beyond the borders, rivals watched and waited. Some prepared to exploit what they believed was softness. Others began their own cautious reforms, not out of compassion, but imitation. Change had become contagious in a way that frightened those invested in stagnation. Leora knew better than to mistake influence for safety. A queen who refused to kneel invited attention that never slept. Yet she also knew retreat would betray everything that had been won. On a clear evening, they stood together on the palace terrace, looking out over a city that still argued, still struggled, but no longer pretended cruelty was order. Alaric spoke quietly of the risks ahead, of enemies patient enough to wait years. Leora answered with the calm certainty that had carried her through the borderlands. They would face those risks together, not as ruler and shield, not as savior and saved, but as partners bound by choice. The kingdom slept beneath them, uneasy but alive with possibility. Beyond its borders, the world took note, measuring the distance between old certainty and new resolve. The rise of a queen who was never meant to kneel had altered more than one realm's balance. And somewhere beyond the horizon, forces gathered, watching, calculating, and waiting for the moment to test whether defiance and unity could endure what was coming next. An Omega once overlooked became a symbol of change, and an Alpha King who ruled alone learned the strength of standing beside someone rather than above them. Together, they proved that power is not defined by control, but by the courage to protect what is right. For the world, it was a shift in order. For them, it was the victory of preserving their identity. Beyond the borders, silence settled, but it was the kind that waits, because when an Omega refuses to kneel, history is forced to turn. If this story stirred something in you, let it travel beyond this screen. Send it to someone who believes stories can challenge power and reshape destiny. More chapters like this are already unfolding here, waiting for those who enjoy depth, emotion, and meaning beneath the surface. Every view strengthens this world, and every share helps it find the people it was meant for. Now tell me, where are you watching from today, and which country should this story reach next?